Somewhere beneath an old mansion, workers made a discovery that no one had a straightforward answer for. It wasn't gold. It wasn't a collapsed storage room. It wasn't the kind of thing that gets filed away with a simple note and forgotten. It was something that sat in an uncomfortable space between the expected and the unexplained. And the more people looked at it, the harder it became to place it into any familiar category. The initial reports were brief. Workers involved in a renovation survey encountered a space below the main structure that didn't appear on any of the plans they were working from. That alone isn't unusual. Old buildings carry surprises. Walls get added. Floors get raised. Spaces get sealed off and forgotten over generations. Most of the time, there's a reasonable explanation waiting just beneath the surface, and the mystery dissolves quickly once someone with the right knowledge takes a look. That didn't happen here. The explanation didn't arrive quickly, and the people who came to provide it left with more questions than they had brought with them. When the news reached a wider audience, the reaction followed a familiar pattern. People assumed the situation would be resolved within days. Someone would identify the space, place it within the known history of the building, and the story would close. Old houses have secrets. That is accepted. Foundations crack and shift over centuries. Things get buried, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through simple neglect. Time covers things. That is normal, and nobody expected this to be different. But this was different, not in a dramatic way. At least not immediately. The difference was quieter than that. It appeared in the details, in the small measurements, the material choices, the structural decisions that didn't line up with what should have been there. Each individual detail could perhaps be explained, but together, they created a picture that resisted the straightforward reading everyone had been expecting. The structure below the mansion didn't match the age of the building above it. This is the first point where the standard explanation begins to weaken. When a feature is found beneath a building, the assumption is that it belongs to that building, that it was built as part of it, or added during one of its later renovation periods. The dates should roughly align. The materials should reflect what was available and commonly used during the construction era. The design logic should fit within the broader architectural approach of the property. Here, none of those alignments held cleanly. The materials found in the underground space were assessed early in the documentation process. Without going into technical specifics that are still being reviewed, the initial assessments suggested the stonework in certain sections was older, noticeably older, than the mansion itself. How much older remained unclear, and that uncertainty is itself significant. When specialists cannot agree on an approximate age, it usually means the object in question falls outside the range of what they commonly encounter. That is not a comfortable position for people whose job is to place things in historical order. The layout also created problems. When a space is built for a functional purpose, storage, access, shelter, its design reflects that purpose. The dimensions make sense. The entry points are placed logically. The interior is arranged to support whatever activity it was meant to contain. A wine cellar looks like a wine cellar. A service tunnel looks like a service tunnel. There is a recognizable internal logic to functional spaces, and experienced surveyors can usually identify what a space was for simply by walking through it. This space did not offer that clarity. The layout raised questions that the surveyors noted in their early reports. The placement of the entrance was not where it would logically be if the space served a standard utility function. The interior proportions didn't fully match any common category, and certain features of the construction, the way specific sections were finished, the care taken in areas that a purely functional space would not require, suggested that whoever built it was building for a purpose that went beyond simple practicality. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The difference between a space built for function and a space built with intention is not always obvious. But when surveyors start noting that care was taken in areas where care was unnecessary, it points toward a builder who had a specific use in mind, a use that the structure itself no longer explains. Some researchers who reviewed the early findings came to the same conclusion that the official categorization had reached, that the space was unusual but not inexplicable, and that further study would likely produce a satisfying answer. They pointed to comparable discoveries at other estate properties and suggested that regional building traditions sometimes produced features that looked strange out of context but made complete sense once the right framework was applied. This is a reasonable position. It is cautious and grounded, and it keeps the interpretation within the boundaries of what is documented and understood. Others looked at the same evidence and said something doesn't add up, not in a way that required extraordinary explanations, but in a way that made the ordinary ones feel insufficient. The missing documentation was one issue. The material age discrepancy was another. The layout inconsistencies were a third. Individually, any one of these could be set aside. Together, they formed a cluster of unresolved details that resisted easy dismissal. This is where the investigation begins, not at the point of discovery, but at the point where the first explanations fail to hold. That failure is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It appears in the gap between what is found and what the available records say should be there. And that gap, in this case, is wider than anyone initially expected. It is worth pausing on what it means when physical evidence and documentary evidence disagree. In historical research, this happens. Records are lost. Documents are misfiled or destroyed. Buildings are modified without proper notation. These are common problems, and historians work around them regularly. But there is a difference between a missing record and a contradicting one. When the physical object in front of you actively conflicts with what the existing documentation describes, that conflict requires an explanation of its own. It is not enough to say the records are incomplete. You have to ask why they are incomplete in this particular way, about this particular feature, across this particular span of time. No one has answered that question cleanly. The space was categorized. The discovery was documented. Researchers were assigned to continue the study. But the central problem, why does this exist here, built this way, at this apparent age, with no trace in any record associated with the property, remained open? It remains open now. That openness is not a failure of the investigation. It is, in a sense, the most honest result the investigation has produced so far. The space exists. Its features have been observed and noted. The explanations offered for it have each encountered points where they don't fully hold. And the work of understanding it continues, slowly, through the kind of careful examination that historical mysteries require. What makes this case particularly difficult to set aside is not any single dramatic element. It is the accumulation of small things that each raise a question without answering it. The age that doesn't fit, the layout that doesn't match its supposed function, the entrance positioned where logic says it shouldn't be, the absence from records that should contain it, the detail and care applied to areas that functional construction would not justify. Each of these, individually, might be explained. Together, they point toward something that the current framework of understanding hasn't fully accounted for. Some investigations begin with a clear question and work toward an answer. This one began with what looked like an answer, a standard categorization, a familiar explanation, and found that the question was still there underneath it. That reversal is uncomfortable. It means the work is not simply about gathering more information. It is about re-examining what the existing information actually shows, and being willing to follow that examination into places where the conclusions are less certain. And that is exactly where this investigation now sits. Not at the beginning of the story, but at the beginning of the real questions. The structure below the mansion raised something that a simple discovery cannot raise on its own. It raised the possibility that the history of this place is not fully known, that what has been recorded and accepted may represent only part of what actually happened here, and that the gap between the official record and the physical evidence may be pointing toward something that has been quietly present all along, unexamined, uncategorized, and waiting for the kind of attention it is only now beginning to receive. The investigation does not start with answers. It starts with a shape that doesn't fit the frame it was placed in. And that gap, between what is there and what should be there, between what the records say and what the structure shows, is exactly what makes this case worth examining carefully, and without rushing toward conclusions that the evidence does not yet support. The official explanation, when it arrived, was not complicated. It was the kind of explanation that fits neatly into a familiar category and asks very little from the people receiving it. The structure found beneath the mansion was identified as a utility space. More specifically, it was described as either a storage area or a service tunnel, the sort of underground feature that appeared regularly in large estate properties during the 18th and 19th centuries. Simple, practical, historical, the kind of answer that closes a question before it has much time to develop. And on the surface, that answer had good support behind it. This is important to acknowledge. The explanation wasn't invented from nothing. It was grounded in genuine historical practice, and the people who offered it were drawing on a well-documented tradition of estate construction. To understand why the explanation seems so reasonable at first, it helps to look at what that tradition actually involved and how common these underground features really were. Wealthy families during the 18th and 19th centuries invested heavily in the design and functionality of their estates. A large property was not simply a house. It was a statement of standing, organization, and refinement. The way a mansion was managed, how smoothly it operated, how invisible its working parts were to guests, reflected directly on the family that owned it. And underground spaces played a significant role in keeping that operation running quietly beneath the surface. Storage was one primary function. Large estates required enormous quantities of food, preserved goods, wine, coal, and other supplies. Keeping those supplies accessible but out of sight required dedicated space. Underground cellars and storage vaults were practical solutions. They maintained consistent temperatures, protected perishable goods, and kept the working inventory of the estate separate from the areas where guests moved and gathered. This was standard. Almost every significant estate of that era had some version of it. Service passages were another common feature. In households where the presence of staff was meant to be efficient but unobtrusive, underground or enclosed passages allowed servants to move between different parts of the property without crossing the main rooms. Food could travel from kitchens to dining areas without passing through guest corridors. Coal and supplies could be moved without disrupting the appearance of the house. These passages were considered a mark of thoughtful design. They indicated that the estate had been planned with care, and that its owners understood how a well-run household should operate. So when historians pointed to this tradition as the explanation for what was found beneath the mansion, they were not reaching. They were connecting the discovery to a practice that genuinely existed, was genuinely widespread, and genuinely produced underground spaces of various kinds beneath properties of this type. The explanation had a foundation that is worth stating clearly before examining where it begins to create problems. The mansion itself supported this reading, at least in its general outline. It had a long recorded history. It was built by a family of some prominence in the region, a family whose name appeared in local records across several generations. Over time, the property passed through different periods of ownership. Some owners invested in the estate and maintained it actively. Others held it with less engagement. Eventually, the mansion reached a state of partial disuse. Not ruin, but the kind of slow decline that comes when a large property no longer has the household it was designed to support. When the renovation survey was commissioned, it was working through a building that had accumulated layers of history, change, and quiet neglect across a considerable span of time. The official records associated with the property described it in terms that aligned with the utility space explanation. Architectural assessments from different periods characterized the mansion as typical for its region and construction era. The style, the materials, the layout, these were all consistent with other estates of comparable age and standing. Nothing in the documented history of the building suggested that it was anything other than what it appeared to be. A large, well-built estate that had passed through time in the ordinary way that large estates do. When the underground space was first reported to local heritage authorities, their response reflected this context. They received the information, reviewed the initial findings, and placed the discovery into the category that the available evidence most readily supported. It was logged as a historic utility structure. It was marked for documentation. It was assigned a place within the broader renovation survey that was already underway. The process was orderly and professionally handled. There was no alarm, no unusual urgency, no indication that the discovery required a response outside of normal heritage procedure. This is how such discoveries are typically managed. A feature is found. It is assessed against known historical categories. If it fits one of those categories with reasonable confidence, it is documented accordingly and passed on for further study as part of a larger process. The system works because most discoveries do fit. Most underground spaces found beneath old estates are exactly what they appear to be: storage rooms, tunnels, cellars, and the standard process handles them efficiently and accurately. At first, this case seemed to follow that pattern. The explanation was offered. It was grounded in historical practice. It was consistent with the general profile of the property, and for a period it held. Most people who heard about the discovery accepted the utility space categorization without significant resistance. Large estates had these features. The explanation was familiar. It required nothing unusual from anyone, and it closed the question in a way that felt appropriate given what was known at the time. But this is where it becomes unclear, because not everyone involved in the survey received the explanation the same way. Some of the people working most closely with the physical space, the ones who had spent time in it, measured it, documented its specific features, did not find that the utility space category settled the matter for them. They continued working. They continued noting details, and the details they were noting did not all point in the same direction as the official categorization. It is important to be precise about what this means. The people who continued looking were not claiming, at that stage, that the official explanation was wrong. They were not proposing an alternative theory or suggesting that something extraordinary had been found. They were simply not satisfied that the categorization fully accounted for what they were observing. There's a difference between disagreeing with an explanation and feeling that an explanation is incomplete. What some of the survey participants experienced was closer to the second. The utility space label fit some of what they saw. It did not fit all of it. That distinction matters because it determines what kind of investigation follows. When an explanation is rejected outright, the response is usually to find a replacement. When an explanation is felt to be incomplete, the response is more careful. It involves going back to the details, looking more closely at the features that don't fit, and asking whether the category being used is broad enough to contain what is actually there. That slower, more precise form of questioning is what began to develop among the people who did not move on quickly after the initial categorization. What they were sitting with, in the days and weeks following the official response, was a collection of observations that hadn't yet been organized into a formal challenge. Individually, each observation could perhaps be absorbed into the utility space explanation with some adjustment, but the accumulation of them created a quiet resistance to the settled reading. Something about the space didn't fully match the category it had been placed in, and the people who felt that couldn't yet say precisely what it was. They only knew that the explanation, as simple and well-supported as it was, hadn't closed the question for them the way it had for others. This is where the investigation takes its first real step, not in a dramatic direction, not toward a bold counterclaim, but inward toward the details, toward the specific features of the space that the utility category had smoothed over without fully addressing. The official explanation remained in place. It was not withdrawn or formally contested, but beneath it, quietly, the questions that it hadn't answered were beginning to gather weight, and the people carrying those questions were starting to look more carefully at exactly what it was they had found. The first real problem with the official explanation didn't take long to surface. It didn't arrive through a dramatic finding or a contested scientific result. It came through something far more ordinary, a search through records. And what that search returned, or more precisely what it failed to return, was the detail that began to pull the accepted explanation apart at its edges. The logic was straightforward. If the underground space was a standard utility feature, a storage vault, a service tunnel, a cellar built to support the daily operation of the estate, then it should appear somewhere in the documented history of the property. That is not an unreasonable expectation. It is, in fact, a basic one. Features of that kind were not built quietly and then forgotten by the people responsible for maintaining them. They were recorded, referenced, and managed as part of the broader administration of the estate. Large properties during the period in question were carefully and consistently documented. This is one of the things that makes historical research on estates of this kind relatively reliable in many cases. Architects who designed significant buildings filed detailed plans. Those plans were referenced during construction, updated during renovation, and retained as part of the property's official record. Estate managers kept running inventories of the property's physical features: what existed, where it was located, what condition it was in. Local authorities recorded structural additions and modifications. When a new feature was added to a property, or when an existing feature was formally identified, it entered a chain of documentation that tended to persist across ownership changes and time. This system wasn't perfect. Records were lost. Documents were damaged or destroyed. Gaps appeared in the historical record for all kinds of reasons. That is understood and expected. But the gaps that researchers encounter in most cases are partial. A specific document is missing. A particular renovation period is poorly covered. One ownership transition is less well recorded than others. These are incomplete records. They leave holes in the picture, but the picture itself is still recognizable. What researchers found when they searched for the underground space in the mansion's documented history was different. The gap wasn't partial. It was total. No existing document from the property's known history mentioned anything beneath the main floor. Not a storage room. Not a tunnel. Not a vault. Not a passage. Not even an indirect reference. No notation of access. No mention of maintenance. No inventory entry. No architectural note. The space was absent from the record in a way that went beyond ordinary incompleteness. That absence was not discovered casually. Researchers conducted a systematic review across multiple archives. They examined the original construction records from when the mansion was first built. They reviewed renovation documentation from the various periods when the property was updated or modified under different owners. They looked at property surveys conducted at different points across the estate's history, surveys that assessed the physical condition and features of the building in reasonable detail. And they checked records held by local heritage and administrative bodies that would have captured any formal additions or structural changes reported during the property's lifetime. The underground space appeared in none of them. Across all of those sources, covering a substantial span of time and multiple distinct phases of the property's history, there was no trace of it in the written record. This is the point where the straightforward explanation encounters its first serious difficulty. Because a utility space that nobody ever wrote down is not behaving the way utility spaces behave. At first, it seems like this might simply be a records problem, and that possibility cannot be ruled out entirely. But this is where it becomes unclear. The absence is not limited to one type of record or one period of ownership. It extends across every category of documentation that should reasonably be expected to contain a reference to the space. For all of them to be missing the same feature, at the same time, across the same property, would require either an extraordinary sequence of unrelated losses or something more deliberate. That word deliberate is not used lightly here. It introduces a possibility that changes the character of the investigation. If the absence from the record is the result of deliberate omission, then someone, at some point, made a decision not to include the underground space in documents where it would normally appear. That decision would have had to be maintained across different owners, different estate managers, different architects, and different administrative periods. That is not impossible, but it is not simple either. It requires an explanation of its own. This raises a second possibility, which is in some ways harder to absorb than the first. The space may predate the mansion entirely. If the underground structure was already there when the mansion was built above it, if it belongs to an earlier period, an earlier structure, or an earlier use of the land, then its absence from the mansion's records would make a different kind of sense. It would not be in those records, because it was never part of the mansion to begin with. It existed before the mansion's history started, and the mansion's documentation simply never reached back far enough to include it. But this possibility opens its own set of questions, and they are not comfortable ones. If the space predates the mansion, then the family that commissioned the construction of the building above it was building on top of something. They may not have known what was there. Construction on old land sometimes proceeds without full knowledge of what lies beneath the surface. That happens. Ground surveys in earlier centuries were not as thorough as they are today, and builders sometimes discovered features mid-construction that had not been anticipated. However, the timeline does not fully match a simple case of unknowing construction. The underground space, based on early assessments, is not a shallow or incidental feature. It is a defined structure with deliberate construction. It has dimensions, materials, and design choices that reflect intentional building. Something of that nature, something with physical presence directly beneath a major estate, is not the kind of thing that goes entirely unnoticed during a significant construction project. Foundations are dug. Ground is disturbed. The physical reality of a construction process on that scale makes complete ignorance of a defined underground structure genuinely difficult to accept without question, which brings the investigation to the second uncomfortable possibility. The mansion may have been built above the underground space, not in ignorance of it, but with some awareness of it, and yet without recording it. If the builders or original owners knew the space was there and chose not to document it, that is a form of concealment. A quieter form than active erasure, perhaps, but a form nonetheless. And it suggests that from the very beginning of the mansion's history, the space beneath it was being treated differently from other features of the property. Both possibilities, active omission across multiple generations, or deliberate non-documentation from the point of original construction, point toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The absence of the underground space from the historical record is not a neutral fact. It is a fact that requires its own explanation, and that explanation, whichever form it takes, introduces a layer of intentionality into the story that the utility space categorization did not account for. A storage room that nobody recorded is not simply an unremarkable storage room. A service tunnel that appears in no plan, no inventory, no survey, and no administrative record across a property's entire documented history is not behaving like a service tunnel. Even if the physical structure itself could eventually be explained within the utility category, the documentary silence surrounding it resists that explanation. The two things, the physical space and the historical record, are not telling the same story, and that gap between them is significant. Some researchers, when presented with this finding, maintained their position that the absence was likely a records problem, that documents had been lost or were simply never produced. They argued that the utility explanation remained the most historically grounded reading of the physical evidence, regardless of what the written record did or didn't contain. This view is cautious and defensible. Record gaps in historical research are real, and the absence of documentation is not automatically evidence of concealment. Others disagreed. They pointed out that the absence was too consistent across too many independent sources to be explained by ordinary record loss. Each archive, each type of document, each ownership period, all of them missing the same feature. That pattern, they argued, required a more active explanation than simple incompleteness. Whether that explanation involved deliberate omission, a structure older than the mansion itself, or some combination of both, the documentary silence was not accidental. It was structured, and structured silence in historical research tends to mean something. Neither position has been resolved. The record search produced a clear finding. The underground space does not appear in the documented history of the property, but it did not produce a clear reason for that absence. The reason remains open. It sits alongside the physical questions about the space's age and layout, adding a second layer of uncertainty to a case that had already begun to resist its first explanation. What this means for the investigation is that the questions have now multiplied. It is no longer only a matter of understanding what the space was built for. It is also a matter of understanding why no one who lived above it, managed it, surveyed it, or formally assessed it ever saw fit to write it down. Those are two separate problems. They may have the same answer. They may have different answers. At this stage, neither has been resolved, and the investigation moves forward carrying both of them, one rooted in stone and structure, the other rooted in paper and silence. To understand why the missing records matter as much as they do, it helps to step back from the underground space itself for a moment and look at something broader. The space does not exist in isolation. It exists within a specific location, a specific plot of land with its own history, its own sequence of uses, and its own layers of time. And when that land history is examined more carefully, the questions surrounding the underground space become harder, not easier, to set aside. The estate sits in a region that has been occupied, used, and modified across a very long span of time. This is not unusual for areas where large properties were eventually established. Land that attracted significant construction in the 18th and 19th centuries was often land that had already attracted human activity in earlier periods. Fertile ground, accessible water, established routes. These features drew settlements long before the era of grand estate building, and the regions that eventually hosted major properties frequently carried deep layers of prior occupation beneath their more visible histories. In this particular region, those layers are documented, at least in part. There are records of agricultural use across earlier centuries. There are references to religious institutions that held or influenced land in the area during medieval and post-medieval periods. These are not unusual findings for a region of this kind. Agricultural use and religious land ownership were among the most common features of the pre-modern landscape in many parts of the world where estate culture later developed. They appear regularly in regional surveys and administrative records, and their presence here does not, on its own, suggest anything irregular. But there is one reference that stands apart from the others. In an older regional survey, one produced several centuries before the mansion was built, there is a notation that refers to a structure standing on or near the specific plot of land where the estate would later be constructed. The notation is brief. It does not describe the structure in any detail. It does not record its purpose. It does not name an owner or identify who was responsible for it. It simply notes the presence of a building at that location, in the language and format typical of a survey entry from that period. That detail sounds minor at first. A single line in an old survey, referring to a building whose purpose is unknown. Regional surveys from earlier centuries are full of abbreviated notations like this, and most of them refer to structures that were demolished, replaced, or simply absorbed into the changing landscape over time. A notation of this kind would normally attract little attention. It would be treated as background information, useful for building a general picture of the land's history, but not specifically significant on its own, until it is examined more closely, because after that single reference, the structure disappears entirely from the record. There are no follow-up mentions, no demolition notice, no record of it being sold, transferred, abandoned, or replaced. No later survey acknowledges its existence or explains what happened to it. It enters the historical record once, and then it is gone, not gradually, not with any documented transition, but completely and without explanation. This is where the background history of the land begins to connect with the questions already raised about the underground space. The structure in the survey notation and the underground space found beneath the mansion are not confirmed to be the same thing. That connection has not been established, and it would be inaccurate to present it as though it had. But the overlap is difficult to ignore entirely. A structure documented on that specific plot of land, purpose unknown, that then vanishes from every subsequent record, and an underground space found on that same plot, absent from the mansion's own documented history, built with materials that appear older than the mansion itself. The two facts sit alongside each other, and the question of whether they are related has not been answered. When the mansion was eventually constructed on that land, the builders made no reference to any prior structure. This could be explained in several ways. The earlier building may have been fully demolished before construction began, with no trace left visible at ground level. Complete demolition of older structures was common practice when land was cleared for new development, and a building that had been thoroughly removed would leave no obvious reason for its new owners to acknowledge it. The survey notation may also have been an error, a misidentified location, a scribe's mistake, a reference that pointed to an adjacent plot rather than this specific one. Survey records from that era were not always precise, and errors of location were not uncommon. But this is where it becomes unclear, because if the earlier structure was fully demolished and the land was clean when the mansion was built, that explanation still does not account for the underground space. A demolished building does not leave a fully constructed underground structure behind. Demolition removes what is visible. It does not typically destroy what is buried, particularly if the buried elements were not recognized or investigated before construction proceeded above them. If the earlier structure had a significant underground component, and that component was left in place when the surface was cleared, then the mansion could have been built above it without the builders having a complete understanding of what lay beneath. That possibility connects directly to the most significant physical detail in this part of the investigation. The stonework found in sections of the underground space does not match the construction date of the mansion. This is not a minor discrepancy. When materials are assessed for approximate age in historical investigations, the findings carry weight precisely because material dating is based on observable physical characteristics, the type of stone, the method of cutting and shaping, the composition of mortar or binding agents, the weathering and wear patterns that accumulate over time. These characteristics don't change to match a preferred narrative. They reflect what was actually produced and when. The early assessments of the stonework in the underground space indicated that certain sections appear significantly older than the mansion's construction period. The word significantly is important here. A small discrepancy in apparent age could be explained by the use of reclaimed materials, by variations in local stone sources, or by differences in construction technique between different craftsmen. These are legitimate explanations for minor age gaps. But when the apparent age difference is described as significant, those ordinary explanations become less comfortable. They require a larger stretch to accommodate a larger gap. How much older the stonework might be is still being debated. No firm conclusion has been published. Different assessments have produced different ranges, and the uncertainty around those ranges reflects genuine difficulty in pinning down the precise age of materials in an underground environment where moisture, pressure, and other conditions can affect the visible aging process. This ongoing debate is not a sign that the question is being avoided. It is a sign that the question is genuinely difficult to answer with the precision that a confident conclusion would require. But even without a firm date, the existence of the debate itself is informative. The fact that specialists examining the stonework cannot comfortably place it within the mansion's construction era means the material is not behaving the way it should behave if the utility space explanation is correct. A storage room built as part of the original mansion, or added during one of its known renovation periods, should contain materials consistent with those periods. The presence of stonework that reads as significantly older introduces a timeline problem that the standard explanation does not resolve. Some researchers have suggested that this could be explained by the use of salvaged stone. Builders in earlier centuries sometimes incorporated older materials into new constructions, either for practical reasons. Recycling available stone was more efficient than quarrying new material, or for aesthetic ones. If the builders of the underground space, or of some later modification to it, used stone sourced from an older demolished structure nearby, that could account for the apparent age difference without requiring the underground space itself to be older than the mansion. This is a reasonable argument. It cannot be dismissed, but it also does not fully resolve the problem. The age discrepancy appears not in isolated stones or occasional repurposed blocks, but in sections of the construction. For salvaged material to explain the findings, it would need to account for a significant portion of the stonework in those sections, all sourced from older material, all incorporated in a way that appears structurally consistent rather than patched or supplementary. That is possible, but it raises its own question. Where did that older stone come from, and why is there no record of its sourcing or use? The land history brings this question back around to the survey notation. If a structure once stood on that plot and was later cleared, its stone could theoretically have been incorporated into new construction. That would create exactly the kind of age discrepancy found in the underground space. Older material appearing within a newer structure. But it would also mean that the earlier structure was not simply demolished and removed. Its physical material persisted on the site. Some of it, perhaps, persists still. This is the persistent problem that the background history of the land introduces. The underground space may not belong to the mansion's history at all. Its materials, its absence from the documentary record, and the earlier reference to a structure on the same land all point toward the possibility that what lies beneath the mansion is not a product of the mansion's construction or ownership. It may be a remnant of something older, something that existed before the mansion was built, before the land was formally surveyed as an estate property, and possibly before the period that the current investigation was originally focused on. That possibility does not come with a confirmed identity. The earlier structure referenced in the survey notation has no documented purpose, no known builder, and no recorded fate. The underground space has no confirmed age, no agreed function, and no documentary origin. Whether they are related remains an open question, but the combination of a vanished prior structure and an underground space with materials that don't fit the mansion's timeline creates a problem that the official utility explanation was never designed to address. The investigation was initially focused on a specific building and a specific period of its history, but the evidence, as it has accumulated, keeps pointing in a direction that stretches further back in time than that initial frame allows. And the further back the questions reach, the less the existing documentation is able to provide answers. As the documentation process continued and researchers spent more time examining the physical details of the underground space, something began to shift in how the investigation was developing. The early questions had been focused on the historical record, on what was missing from the documents, on the land's prior history, on the age of the materials. Those were important findings, but they were findings rooted in paper and archive work. What began to emerge next came from space itself, from the physical features that surveyors were observing, measuring, and recording as they worked through the documentation systematically. What they found was a collection of inconsistencies, not a single dramatic contradiction, but a set of details that, when looked at carefully and honestly, did not fully align with the category the space had been placed into. Each inconsistency, taken on its own, might be explained. Each one, viewed in isolation, might be absorbed into the utility space reading without too much difficulty. But they did not appear in isolation. They appeared together, as a cluster, and that cluster created a problem that became increasingly difficult to set aside the more precisely the documentation work proceeded. The first inconsistency, and the one that surveyors noted earliest in the process, involved the entrance to the space. This is worth examining carefully, because entrance design in utility spaces is not a decorative consideration. It is a functional one. The entire purpose of a utility space in an estate setting is to support the working operation of the household. Storage rooms need to be accessed regularly. Supplies need to be moved in and out. Workers need to be able to reach the space efficiently, sometimes carrying heavy or bulky items, sometimes moving quickly between tasks. All of this demands a practical entrance, one that is easy to reach, appropriately sized for the traffic it needs to accommodate, and logically connected to the parts of the estate where that traffic originates. In a well-designed estate, utility spaces were typically connected to the service infrastructure of the property. Entrances opened from kitchens, from staff corridors, from ground-level external access points, or from the working areas where the household's functional activity was concentrated. The placement of a utility entrance was not arbitrary. It followed the logic of the work the space was meant to support. An experienced architect or estate designer would position such an entrance exactly where it needed to be to serve its purpose efficiently. The entrance found here did not follow that logic. It was narrow, narrower than a functional access point for a working storage area would typically be. It was partially concealed, positioned in a way that did not present itself as an obvious or intended entry point, and its location within the building was the detail that raised the clearest question. It was situated in a section of the mansion that had no connection to any known service area, not near the kitchens, not adjacent to a staff corridor, not accessible from any external ground-level point associated with the working parts of the estate. Reaching it required passing through two separate rooms. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Those two rooms, based on the original architectural layout of the mansion, were not part of the working areas of the estate. They were interior rooms, rooms associated with the private or formal sections of the building rather than its service infrastructure. A worker carrying supplies to a storage area does not pass through the private rooms of an estate. That is precisely what service passages and dedicated utility corridors were designed to prevent. The entire point of separate service infrastructure in estates of this kind was to keep the working movement of the household away from the formal and private spaces. An entrance that requires passing through private interior rooms to reach a utility space is not functioning as a utility entrance. It is functioning as something else. What that something else might be is not immediately clear, but the placement is inconsistent with the purpose the space was officially assigned. and that inconsistency cannot be resolved simply by pointing to the physical existence of the entrance. The question is not whether the entrance exists. The question is why it is positioned where it is, in a way that makes no practical sense for a working storage area. The second inconsistency involved the interior dimensions of the space. When surveyors moved past the entrance and began documenting the space from the inside, one of the things they recorded was that the interior was larger than the entrance suggested it would be. This is not an impossible feature. Buildings of all kinds sometimes contain spaces that open up beyond what their entry points imply. And in an underground structure, where the relationship between entrance and interior can be less immediately readable than in an above-ground room, a size discrepancy might seem unremarkable at first glance. But this is where it becomes unclear. For a simple storage area, interior dimensions are typically kept practical and proportional. The space is sized to accommodate what it needs to hold, with enough room for workers to move and access what is stored. Builders working on underground utility spaces did not add unnecessary volume without reason. Digging and constructing underground space required significant labor and material investment. Every additional unit of space had a cost attached to it. Storage rooms were built to the size they needed to be. They were not built larger than their function required. A space that is noticeably larger than its entrance suggests, and larger than functional storage logic would justify, is a space that was built with dimensions that served a different purpose than storage. What that purpose might be remains an open question, but the size itself is a design decision. Someone determined how large the space should be, and the result does not match the measurements of a practical storage area. That gap between the size of a space and the logic of its supposed function adds a second layer of difficulty to the utility category explanation. The third inconsistency is the one that surveyors found hardest to dismiss. It concerns the interior of the space at the level of its built-in features, or more precisely, at the level of what was absent from it. A functional storage space in an estate of this era would not have been a bare room. It would have contained the physical infrastructure needed to support its function: shelving for stored goods, hooks or mounting points for hanging items, drainage features to manage moisture in an underground environment where water management was a genuine concern, ventilation provisions to allow air circulation and prevent the kind of damp accumulation that would damage stored goods over time. These are not optional extras. They are the components that make a storage space function as a storage space. An underground room without shelving, without drainage, without ventilation, is not a storage room in any practical sense. It is a room that was built below ground, finished to a certain standard, and then left without the features that would allow it to serve a storage purpose. The shell of a utility space, without its utility. And this is where the explanation becomes genuinely difficult, because the absence of these features is not the absence of things that might have been removed or deteriorated over time. Shelving leaves mounting marks on walls. Drainage channels leave physical traces in flooring and stonework. Ventilation systems leave openings or passages that remain visible even after the moving components have been removed or have degraded. When surveyors looked for evidence that these features had once been present and were later lost to time or deliberate removal, they found no clear indication that they had ever existed in the first place. That is a different kind of absence from ordinary deterioration. It is the absence of the physical markers that functional features always leave behind, even when the features themselves are gone. And it points toward a space that was not built to function as storage, not originally, not as a primary purpose, and possibly not at all in that sense. Some researchers, when presented with these three inconsistencies together, maintained that each one could be individually explained. The entrance placement could reflect a later modification to the building's layout that shifted its relationship to the service areas. The size discrepancy could be the result of construction choices that prioritized available underground space over strict proportional efficiency. The absence of functional features could reflect a storage space that was built but never fully fitted out, a space prepared for a use that was ultimately never implemented. These arguments have some merit. None of them can be completely ruled out. Building histories are complex, and individual features that look inconsistent in isolation sometimes make more sense when a fuller picture of the construction and modification sequence becomes available. This is why researchers in this field are cautious about drawing firm conclusions from physical inconsistencies alone, without the documentary evidence to support a specific reading. But others disagree with that cautious position, and their disagreement is grounded in the cumulative weight of the three inconsistencies together. One unexplained feature is an anomaly. Two unexplained features are a pattern beginning to form. Three unexplained features, all pointing in the same direction, away from a utility explanation and toward a space designed for a different purpose, are difficult to absorb as a set of unrelated coincidences. The entrance, the dimensions, and the absent functional infrastructure are three separate observations, but they produce one consistent signal. The space was not built to do what a utility space does. What it was built to do remains the unresolved question. The inconsistencies identify the problem. They describe the gap between the official category and the physical reality of the space, but they do not, on their own, fill that gap with an alternative explanation. They close one door without opening another, and that is a specific kind of difficult position for an investigation to be in, knowing with increasing confidence what something is not, while remaining genuinely uncertain about what it is. The documentation work continued after these findings were recorded. Surveyors returned to the space with the inconsistencies in mind, looking for anything that had been missed or that might help resolve the questions the physical features had raised. The official categorization remained in place formally, but among the people working most closely with the evidence, the utility space label had become a placeholder rather than a conclusion, a category assigned at the beginning of the process that the physical details of the space were steadily and quietly undermining, one observation at a time. By this point in the investigation, something had shifted in how the researchers were approaching the space. The early work had focused on what the official explanation said the space was, and on testing whether the available evidence supported that reading. The missing records, the material age discrepancy, the entrance placement, the absent functional features. Each of these findings had chipped away at the utility space categorization without fully replacing it. The official label remained, but the confidence behind it had been quietly eroding, and the people working most closely with the physical evidence were beginning to ask a different kind of question. Instead of asking whether the space fit the utility category, they began asking what the space actually looked like when its features were read on their own terms, without the official category as a starting frame. This is a methodological shift that happens in investigations when the initial explanation has accumulated enough unresolved problems to justify stepping back from it. It doesn't mean the original explanation is abandoned. It means the evidence is given room to suggest its own reading, rather than being filtered through a predetermined one. And when researchers applied that approach to the underground space, the picture that began to form was noticeably different from the one the utility label had produced. The first feature that drew significant attention in this phase of the examination was the ceiling height. This is a detail that had been noted in the initial documentation, but had not yet been given the weight it deserved. In the context of a storage room or service tunnel, ceiling height is a functional consideration. It needs to be high enough to allow a person to stand and move, but not significantly higher than that. Additional height in an underground construction serves no practical purpose for storage. It does not increase storage capacity in any meaningful way. It does not improve access or workflow. What it does do, very clearly, is increase the cost and labor of construction. Building underground requires excavation. Every additional unit of depth means more material removed, more structural support required, and more effort invested in creating a stable enclosed space below the surface. Builders of the 18th and 19th centuries understood this very well. Underground utility spaces were constructed to the minimum height needed to serve their function, because every foot beyond that minimum represented unnecessary cost and effort. Efficiency was the guiding principle. Practical spaces were built practically. The ceiling in the underground space beneath the mansion was notably high, not marginally higher than expected, but noticeably, meaningfully higher, the kind of height that would have required a deliberate decision to include. This is not a detail that appears by accident in underground construction. It appears because someone decided it should be there, and that decision carries a question attached to it. Why would a builder invest the additional labor and material required to create significant ceiling height in a space that was supposedly intended only for storage or service access. High ceilings in underground spaces of this age and type tend to appear in specific contexts. They appear in spaces where the ceiling height served a purpose, where people needed to move freely and upright, where activities required vertical space, or where the design of the room was intended to communicate something beyond pure utility. Ceremonial spaces, meeting rooms, and gathering areas built underground during this period frequently featured elevated ceilings. The height was part of the design intention. It contributed to the function and the atmosphere of the space in ways that purely practical rooms did not require. Storage rooms, by contrast, were built low. This room was not, and that distinction, when placed alongside the entrance positioning, the absent functional infrastructure, and the material age questions that had already accumulated, added another layer to the picture that was forming. The ceiling height was not an isolated anomaly. It was consistent with the other features of the space in pointing away from a utility purpose and toward something that required more deliberate and costly design choices. The second feature that drew focused attention in this phase was the condition of the walls. Stonework in old underground spaces typically shows the effects of time in predictable ways: moisture damage, surface erosion, the gradual deterioration of mortar, the accumulation of deposits from groundwater contact. These are the natural signatures of an enclosed underground environment across decades and centuries, and surveyors working in spaces of this kind are experienced in reading them. What the surveyors noted in certain sections of the walls here was different from ordinary deterioration. There were marks in the stonework that indicated the walls had once supported attachments of some kind. The physical evidence suggested brackets, fixtures, or mounting points had been set into the stone at regular intervals in specific sections of the walls. The pattern of these marks was not random. It was deliberate and uniform, the kind of spacing and placement that reflects a planned installation rather than incidental use of the walls over time. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the question those marks raise is not simply what was mounted on the walls. The question is what happened to whatever was there. The marks indicate that something was installed. They also indicate that it was removed. Not lost to deterioration, removed. The distinction matters because deterioration leaves its own traces. When fixtures fail over time through rust, decay, or structural collapse, the evidence of that failure remains. The remnants of corroded metal, the fractured points where brackets gave way, the displaced stone around failing anchor points. These are the signatures of time and entropy working on installed objects. The walls here did not show those signatures. They showed clean removal. The mounting points were vacated in a way that suggested deliberate extraction rather than gradual decay. Whatever had been on those walls was taken down intentionally, at some point, by people who were systematically clearing the space of its installed contents. The uniformity of the removal, the fact that it applied consistently across the relevant wall sections, rather than appearing sporadically, reinforced the impression that this was a planned process rather than an incidental one. This raises questions that the utility space explanation has no ready answer for. Storage rooms accumulate contents over time. They do not typically get deliberately emptied of their built-in fixtures. Service tunnels are maintained, repaired, and occasionally modified, but the physical infrastructure of their walls is not systematically stripped out. When a space is carefully emptied of everything that was mounted on its walls, it suggests that the people doing the emptying had a reason to remove those things, a reason significant enough to justify the effort of systematic extraction rather than simply leaving things in place as a space fell into disuse. When researchers considered the ceiling height and the cleared walls together, and then placed those observations alongside the findings that had preceded them, the concealed entrance, the interior dimensions, the absent functional features, the material age discrepancy, the missing documentation, the picture that emerged was coherent in a way that the utility explanation had never quite managed to be. All of these features pointed in a consistent direction, not toward a space that had been built for storage and had simply aged poorly, toward a space that had been built for a specific purpose, used for that purpose over some period of time, and then deliberately returned to a condition of emptiness before it was sealed or abandoned. The phrase carefully emptied is important here. It is not a dramatic phrase. It is a precise one. A space that has been carefully emptied is different from a space that has been neglected or abandoned. Neglect produces a different kind of evidence: accumulated debris, deteriorating contents, the gradual disorder that comes from disuse without intervention. Careful emptying produces what surveyors found here: clean walls where fixtures once stood, a room that contains almost no trace of what it once held. Not because time removed those traces, but because someone did. Some researchers were cautious about drawing strong conclusions from this combination of features. They acknowledged the ceiling height and the wall marks as genuinely unusual, but argued that unusual features in old estate buildings were not uncommon, and that the absence of a clear alternative explanation did not automatically invalidate the utility categorization. The space might have had a specific utility function that simply wasn't well represented in the historical record. It might have been used for a purpose that was eventually discontinued, leading to the removal of its fittings. These possibilities exist, and they are not unreasonable. Others found that position increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of the accumulated evidence. The argument that each feature could be individually explained was losing force as the features multiplied. At some point, a collection of individually explainable anomalies becomes a pattern, and a pattern demands a pattern-level explanation. The ceiling height, the cleared walls, the entrance, the dimensions, the absent infrastructure, the missing records, the older materials. These were no longer a set of separate puzzles. They were beginning to look like a single story, told through physical evidence, about a space that had been designed with care, used with purpose, and then intentionally cleared. What that purpose was remained unconfirmed. This is the point where the physical evidence, however suggestive, reaches the boundary of what it can directly tell us. The features of the space describe a room that was built to a deliberate design, maintained in active use, and eventually emptied. They do not name the activity that took place in it. They do not identify who used it, when, or under what circumstances. They point toward intentionality without specifying what the intention was. And that gap between the physical evidence of deliberate design and use and the absence of any documentation explaining what the design and use were for is the core of the problem that the investigation now faces. The space has been described in increasing detail. Its features have been documented, compared, and assessed. The picture of what it is not has become clearer with each phase of examination. But the picture of what it actually was: what purpose drew its builders to invest in ceiling height, to install and later remove whatever lined its walls, to position its entrance in a section of the building associated with privacy rather than service. That picture has not yet come into focus. The investigation has reached a point where the physical evidence is speaking clearly enough to be heard, but not clearly enough to be fully understood. The space is telling a story. The details of that story are present in its construction, its dimensions, and its carefully cleared walls. What remains missing is the part of the story that explains why all of those choices were made. And without that explanation, the most honest position available is that something significant happened in this space. Something deliberate, something sustained, and something that someone, at some point, decided should leave as few traces as possible. One of the more difficult aspects of this case, and one that took time to fully register, is that the features found in this underground space do not appear to be unique to this property. As the investigation developed and the findings from the mansion were documented and discussed among researchers familiar with similar work in the region, a detail began to emerge that added an entirely new dimension to the questions already on the table. The inconsistencies found here had been seen before, not in identical form and not with identical details, but in a pattern close enough to be notable. And that similarity, once recognized, changed the character of the investigation in a significant way. Up to this point, the questions surrounding the underground space could be treated as the specific problems of a specific property. Unusual features in a single building can be explained by the particular circumstances of that building, its owners, its construction history, its modifications over time, its individual gaps in documentation. A single anomalous space, however difficult to explain, remains a local problem. It belongs to one site, one archive, one sequence of ownership. The investigation, however puzzling, stays bounded. But this is where it becomes unclear, because when similar features appear across multiple separate properties in the same region, the local explanation loses its containment. The problem is no longer specific to one site. It has spread across the landscape, touching different properties, different families, different periods of recorded history. And that spread requires a different kind of explanation, one that accounts not just for a single unusual space, but for a pattern of unusual spaces distributed across a defined geographic area. The comparison properties were identified through a combination of existing heritage survey records and direct researcher communication. At least 2 other estates within a comparable geographic area had produced underground spaces during renovation or survey work at various points in the past. These discoveries had each been documented separately, handled through their respective local heritage processes, and categorized, as was the case with the mansion, within the utility space framework or something similarly broad. They had not been linked to each other or to the mansion's underground space in any formal analysis before the current investigation began drawing the comparison. When researchers looked at the documented features of these other spaces alongside the features that had been accumulating from the mansion's case, the overlaps were specific enough to be taken seriously. The first overlap was in entrance design. In both comparison properties, the underground spaces had been accessed through entry points described in their documentation as non-standard. In one case, the entrance was noted as unusually narrow and positioned away from the service infrastructure of the estate. In another, the access point had been found partially concealed behind a structural feature that appeared to have been added after the original construction. Neither entrance followed the logic of a functional utility access point. Both shared that characteristic with what had been found at the mansion. The second overlap concerned ceiling height. In both comparison properties, the recorded interior dimensions of the underground spaces included ceiling heights that exceeded what functional storage or service use would require. The surveyors who had documented those spaces had noted the height as an unusual feature, but had not pursued the observation further in either case. It had been recorded and passed over, but read alongside the mansion's findings. The repeated appearance of elevated ceiling height in underground spaces across different estates in the same region was no longer easy to treat as incidental. It was appearing consistently across independent discoveries at properties with no direct documented connection to each other. The third overlap was in the condition of the interior walls. In at least one of the comparison properties, the underground space showed signs that its walls had once supported attachments that were no longer present. The marks left in the stonework were described in the original survey documentation in terms similar to those used in the mansion's case: uniform spacing, deliberate placement, clean removal. The original surveyors had noted the marks without providing an explanation for them. They had been recorded as a feature of the space and left unresolved in the documentation, but their presence in another property's underground space, matching the pattern found at the mansion, was a detail that demanded attention. The documentary situation at the comparison properties followed a similar track as well. In both cases, the underground spaces were either absent from the official historical records of the properties or present in documentation that did not accurately describe their physical characteristics. One space had been mentioned in a single renovation note, but described in terms that significantly understated its dimensions. The other had no documentary trace at all across the property's known record history. The pattern of documentary absence or mismatch that had been so notable in the mansion's case was not unique to that case. It repeated. What the pattern does accomplish, regardless of which interpretation is ultimately correct, is to change the scale of the question. Before the comparison properties were identified, this was an investigation into a single unusual underground space at a single property. The questions were local and specific. Now the questions have a regional dimension. They extend across multiple sites, multiple ownership histories, multiple archive gaps. The investigation is no longer looking at an anomaly. It may be looking at the visible edge of something larger, a pattern of construction and concealment that repeated across the landscape of this region, for reasons that no one has yet been able to clearly identify. That possibility is not comfortable. It does not resolve neatly into any of the frameworks the investigation began with. It does not support the utility explanation, which was never designed to account for a regional pattern of non-functional underground spaces with shared unusual features. But it does not clearly support any specific alternative either. The pattern is present. Its meaning is not. What can be said, with reasonable confidence, is that the underground space beneath the mansion is no longer best understood as an isolated curiosity of a single property. It appears to belong to a set, a group of similar spaces in similar contexts, with similar features and similar silence in the historical record surrounding them. Whether that set reflects a shared tradition, a shared purpose, or a shared decision to keep certain things unrecorded, remains the question that the investigation has not yet found a way to answer. And that question, now that it has been identified, is significantly harder to set aside than any of the questions that came before it. As the investigation continued and the questions surrounding the underground space grew more layered, the researchers involved began to look beyond the structure itself. This was a natural progression. When a physical space resists explanation through its own features and its own documentary record, the next step is to examine the broader context in which it exists, the surrounding properties, the regional land history, and the human decisions that shape the area over time. What that broader examination produced was not a simple answer. It was a new set of observations that added weight to the questions already present without resolving any of them. The starting point for this expanded phase of research was the land records. Property records from the relevant period are among the more reliable categories of historical documentation available to researchers. Land transactions were legally significant events that generated formal paperwork, deed transfers, conveyance documents, registry entries, and in many cases correspondence between the parties involved or their legal representatives. These records were maintained because property ownership had direct legal and financial consequences, and the institutions responsible for maintaining them had strong practical reasons to keep them complete and accurate. For researchers, land records often provide a cleaner and more continuous trail through history than many other document types. When the land records for the mansion and its neighboring estates were reviewed more carefully in this phase of the investigation, what emerged was a picture that had not been visible when each property's history was examined in isolation. Looked at individually, each property's ownership history appeared to follow its own particular path. But when the properties were placed side by side and their ownership timelines were compared, a pattern became visible that the individual records had not suggested on their own. Several properties in the area, including the mansion at the center of this investigation, changed hands within a relatively concentrated period during the mid-19th century. The transfers were spread across a span of years, not compressed into a single moment, but they clustered in a way that stood out when the regional picture was assembled. Multiple estates in the same geographic area, passing from one set of owners to another within a period short enough to suggest something more than ordinary generational turnover or random market activity. The transfers themselves were legal and properly recorded. This is an important point. There is no suggestion that the ownership changes involved anything fraudulent or formally irregular. The documents existed. The transactions followed the legal procedures of the period. On that level, everything was in order. But what those documents revealed about the circumstances surrounding the sales was noticeably thin. The reasons for the transfers, where reasons were given at all, were described in vague terms. Financial restructuring, private arrangement, settlement of estate affairs. These are phrases that appear regularly in property transfer documents of the period, and in most cases they are unremarkable. They describe the ordinary mechanics of a transaction without providing the background that produced it. But this is where it becomes unclear. In a standard property transaction of this era, particularly one involving a significant estate, the surrounding documentation tends to be more substantial. Estate auctions were common and publicly announced. Sales conducted through agents generated correspondence. Even private sales between parties who preferred discretion typically left traces in solicitors' records, family papers, or local administrative documents that recorded the transfer of significant assets. The paper trail around a major estate sale was rarely limited to the deed of transfer alone. For several of the properties in this regional cluster, that surrounding documentation was either thin or absent. The sales had occurred quietly. There were no records of public auction notices, no evidence of the kind of agent correspondence that typically accompanied significant property transactions. No family papers documenting the decision to sell, the negotiations involved, or the circumstances that made the sale necessary. The transactions were completed and recorded, and then the trail stopped. What had motivated the decisions to sell, and why those decisions had come together across multiple properties in the same area over a concentrated period, was not explained in any document that researchers were able to locate. At first, this seems explainable through the ordinary difficulties of the period. The mid-19th century was a time of significant economic and social change in many regions where estate culture had previously been stable. Agricultural income fluctuated. Estate maintenance costs were substantial and growing. Families that had held land for generations found themselves managing properties that had become financially burdensome. Quiet sales, conducted without the publicity of auction and without extensive documentation of the circumstances, were not unusual outcomes in this environment. Financial difficulty did not always announce itself, and families who needed to sell sometimes preferred to do so with as little public attention as possible. These are legitimate explanations, and they cannot be set aside. However, the timeline does not fully match a straightforward picture of individual financial difficulty playing out independently across multiple properties. When several estates in the same geographic area transfer quietly within a similar period, the coincidence of timing invites a question about whether the individual circumstances were truly independent, or whether something connected them. Not necessarily something irregular, but something, a shared condition, a common pressure, a regional factor that affected multiple properties in a similar way at a similar time. What that factor might have been is not apparent from the records that survive. There is also the matter of what happened to the families who sold. In cases where property transfers result from ordinary financial or generational circumstances, the families involved typically remain traceable afterward. They move to smaller properties. They relocate to urban centers. They appear in subsequent records, census entries, correspondence, professional registrations, church records, that allow a historian to follow their path after the sale. The continuity of family history may become quieter after a significant asset is lost, but it does not usually disappear entirely. For several of the families who sold estates in this regional cluster during the relevant period, the subsequent record is unusually sparse. Some left the region entirely after the sale of their properties. Where they went, and what their lives looked like afterward, is either poorly documented or difficult to trace with confidence. Researchers who followed these families through available records found that the trails became thin shortly after the property transfers, and in some cases effectively vanished. This is not impossible. People moved. Records were lost or never created. Families who had been prominent primarily because of their land sometimes faded from documentation when that land was gone. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the pattern of departure, multiple families, multiple properties, the same regional area, the same concentrated period, repeats in the same way that the ownership transfers themselves repeated. And repetition of this kind, even when each individual instance can be individually explained, begins to generate a question about whether the repetition itself means something. Not necessarily something sinister, but something that the individual explanations, applied one at a time, do not fully account for collectively. Some researchers who reviewed these findings maintained their position that the land records and family histories were following patterns consistent with ordinary mid-19th century estate decline. They pointed to the well-documented pressures that affected landed families in this period across many regions, and argued that the clustering of sales and departures was the kind of coincidence that broad economic and social trends produced regularly. Multiple families facing similar pressures in the same area would naturally produce similar outcomes over a similar period. The absence of detailed documentation around the sales was unfortunate, but not surprising given what was known about record survival from this era. Others were less comfortable with that reading. They pointed out that the specific combination of features, quiet sales, thin surrounding documentation, families that departed and left sparse subsequent records, was appearing not just across the ownership histories, but layering directly onto the other findings of the investigation. The underground space, with its missing documentation, the regional pattern of similar spaces at comparable estates, and now an ownership history across those same estates that showed a concentrated period of quiet transfers and departures, with families who afterward became difficult to trace. None of these layers, considered separately, constitutes clear evidence of anything specific. This point is worth repeating, because it is easy in an investigation of this kind to allow the accumulation of suggestive details to carry more interpretive weight than the evidence actually supports. Missing records are common. Quiet property sales occurred regularly. Families declined and dispersed. Underground spaces sometimes have features that resist easy categorization. Each of these things is true, and each can be explained within ordinary historical parameters. But the question that the investigation now faces is not whether each element can be individually explained. It is whether the pattern they form together, the physical space, the documentary silence, the regional repetition, the ownership clustering, the departing families, can be fully explained by treating each element as independent of the others. When the same period produces an unusual underground space, missing documentation, similar spaces at nearby estates, a cluster of quiet property transfers, and families that become difficult to trace, the sum of those observations creates a picture that resists being read as a simple collection of unrelated coincidences. What that picture actually shows is still unclear. The investigation has not produced a framework that accounts for all of these elements together in a way that resolves the questions they collectively raise. What it has produced is a consistent signal that something was happening in this region, across these properties, during this period, that the surviving historical record does not fully explain. Whether that something was a shared private practice, a common external pressure, an undocumented social or institutional network, or simply a concentration of ordinary historical forces producing similar outcomes by coincidence. None of these possibilities has been confirmed or eliminated. The scope of the investigation has grown considerably from where it began. What started as a question about a single underground space has expanded into a question about a regional pattern of properties, people, and decisions that each left unusual gaps in the historical record. The underground space is still at the center of the investigation, but the center now sits within a much larger context, one that the original categorization of the space as a simple utility feature was never equipped to address, and one that continues to raise questions faster than the available evidence is able to answer them. At this stage in the investigation, the evidence has been examined from multiple directions. The physical features of the underground space have been documented and assessed. The historical record surrounding the property has been searched and found to contain significant gaps. The regional pattern of similar spaces at comparable estates has been identified and noted. The ownership histories of the properties involved have been reviewed, and their unusual clustering has been observed. The picture that has assembled from all of this work is detailed, layered, and genuinely difficult to read within the framework of the original utility space explanation. What the investigation has not yet produced is a confirmed alternative. The evidence points away from the original categorization with increasing consistency. But pointing away from one explanation is not the same as pointing clearly toward another. And this is the position the investigation now occupies, a space between a discredited official reading and an alternative that has not yet been established with sufficient confidence to replace it. Into that space, several interpretations have been put forward by researchers who have studied the evidence carefully. None of them has been confirmed. None of them fully accounts for every detail. But each deserves to be examined on its own terms, because each captures something real about the evidence, even while leaving other parts of it unexplained. The first interpretation, and the one that accounts for the largest number of the physical features found in the space, is that the underground room was used for private gatherings, meetings of a group that operated outside of public visibility and maintained deliberate secrecy about its activities and locations. This interpretation has a solid historical foundation. Groups of this kind were genuinely common during the 18th and 19th centuries. Fraternal organizations, private religious associations, philosophical societies, and various forms of closed membership groups existed throughout this period in many parts of the world. They varied widely in their purposes and their levels of secrecy, but many of them shared a preference for meeting in spaces that were not publicly visible or officially recorded. The architectural features associated with spaces used by such groups are reasonably well documented in cases where those spaces have been identified and studied. Elevated ceilings appear regularly in meeting rooms designed for groups that conducted formal gatherings, spaces where a sense of designated purpose was built into the physical environment. Concealed or non-standard entrances are a consistent feature of spaces intended to be used privately, where the movement of members needed to be managed discreetly, and the deliberate removal of interior fixtures, the clearing of walls, the extraction of installed objects, is a pattern that appears in spaces associated with groups that moved or disbanded, taking their materials with them and leaving the physical space as empty as possible. When this interpretation is applied to the underground space, the fit is notable. The elevated ceiling aligns with a meeting room designed for formal or structured gatherings. The concealed entrance, positioned away from the service areas of the estate and requiring passage through private interior rooms, aligns with a space designed for discreet access by a specific group rather than regular use by household staff. The cleared walls, with their uniform mounting marks, align with a space that once held installed objects of significance to the group using it, objects that were systematically removed when the space was no longer in use. Even the absence from official records aligns with the documented practice of such groups, which routinely kept their meeting locations out of any documentation that could become public. But this is where it becomes unclear, because while the first interpretation fits several of the physical features well, it does not fully account for all of the evidence. The regional pattern of similar spaces across multiple estates is one area where the interpretation creates difficulty. A single private meeting space at a single estate is consistent with the activities of a closed group, but similar spaces appearing across multiple properties in the same region, each with the same unusual features and the same documentary silence, suggests either that the group had connections across multiple estates, which is possible but adds a layer of organizational complexity that the evidence does not directly support, or that something other than a single group's activity is responsible for the pattern. The interpretation fits the mansion's space reasonably well. It fits the regional picture less cleanly. The second interpretation approaches the evidence from a different direction entirely. Rather than focusing on the use of the space during the mansion's period of occupation, it focuses on the age of the stonework and what that age might indicate about the space's origins. Some researchers who have examined the material evidence believe the underground structure is substantially older than the mansion, not by decades, but potentially by centuries. Under this reading, the space does not belong to the mansion's history at all. It predates it by a significant margin, possibly predating any of the known settlement records for the area. This interpretation draws on the material age assessments that were noted earlier in the investigation. The findings that certain sections of stonework in the underground space appeared significantly older than the mansion's construction period, with specialists unable to agree on a precise age range. If that older dating reflects the actual construction period of the space, then the mansion was built above a structure that already existed when its foundations were laid. The original owners either discovered the space during construction and chose not to document it, or they already knew it was there and made the same choice for their own reasons. The absence from the mansion's historical records would, under this interpretation, reflect not ongoing secrecy during the mansion's period of ownership, but a decision made at or near the beginning of that ownership. A decision to acknowledge the existing underground structure in no official document, to leave it out of the architectural record, and to allow it to exist beneath the building without formal recognition. Why such a decision would be made is a question the interpretation raises without answering. The space may have been considered irrelevant to the mansion's operation. It may have been considered significant in a way that made silence preferable to disclosure. Or it may have been considered something that the original owners did not fully understand and chose to leave undisturbed. However, the timeline does not fully match a straightforward case of ancient remnant preservation. If the space predates the mansion by centuries, its relationship to the regional pattern of similar spaces at comparable estates becomes difficult to explain. Estates built in the same region during the same general era, all producing underground spaces with similar features, including similar clearing of walls and similar non-standard entrances, would be a remarkable coincidence if each space independently predated its respective estate by a comparable amount of time. The second interpretation handles the age question well but struggles to account for the consistency of the regional pattern, which suggests something more recent than ancient origins, shared across multiple sites. The third interpretation is the most conservative of the three, and it deserves serious consideration precisely because of that conservatism. It holds that the underground space is genuinely unusual, that its features are difficult to explain within standard categories, but that the difficulty reflects a gap in the historical record rather than anything that requires an extraordinary explanation. Under this view, the space is an architectural oddity. It was built for a purpose that was clear to its builders and users at the time, but was simply never documented in a way that survived. The features that seem inconsistent or unexplained are the result of a specific, practical function that we no longer have the documentary context to identify, not the result of deliberate secrecy or ancient origins. This interpretation is intellectually honest about the limits of what the evidence actually shows. It acknowledges the unusual features without overloading them with interpretive weight. It accepts that buildings from this period regularly produced features that look strange out of context, and that the absence of documentation is a common problem in historical research rather than a reliable indicator of something hidden. It asks the investigation to remain within the boundaries of what can be demonstrated rather than reaching toward explanations that the evidence does not directly support. At first, this seems like the most appropriately cautious reading available, and it is in certain respects, but there's a problem with applying it fully to this case. The conservative interpretation works best when the unusual features are limited and isolated, when a single space at a single property has one or two unexplained characteristics that the documentary record doesn't address. It becomes more difficult to sustain when the unusual features are multiple, consistent, repeated across independent sites, and accompanied by a pattern of ownership and departure that adds human behavior to the picture alongside architectural evidence. An architectural oddity that accumulated mystery because no one documented it properly is a reasonable explanation for one space. It is harder to apply to a regional pattern of spaces sharing the same unusual features and the same documentary silence. The conservative interpretation does not engage with the regional pattern in a way that resolves the questions that pattern raises. It addresses the individual case while leaving the broader picture unexplained. Each of these three interpretations, then, captures something real. The first fits the physical features of the space, but struggles with the regional pattern. The second addresses the age question, but cannot fully account for the consistency across multiple properties. The third maintains appropriate caution, but does not adequately address the scale of what the investigation has found. None of them is complete. None of them accounts for all of the evidence in a way that would allow the investigation to close confidently around a single conclusion. This is where the investigation honestly stands, not in a position of total uncertainty. Evidence has produced real and specific findings that narrow the range of reasonable explanations considerably, but not in a position of resolution either. The three interpretations on the table each carry genuine problems alongside their genuine strengths, and the work of determining which one, if any, best fits the full body of evidence has not yet been completed. What can be said is that the investigation has moved the question significantly forward from where it began. The original utility space explanation has been tested against the evidence and found insufficient. The alternative interpretations now in play are more carefully calibrated to the specific features of the space and the specific patterns of the regional record. But calibration is not confirmation, and the distance between a well-reasoned interpretation and a confirmed one remains significant. The evidence continues to be examined. The material assessments are ongoing. The archive searches have not been exhausted. The comparison between the mansion's underground space and the comparable spaces at neighboring estates has not yet been conducted with the level of formal rigor that a definitive analysis would require. The investigation is still moving, and until it reaches a point where the evidence supports one interpretation clearly enough to set the others aside, the honest answer to the question of what the underground space was used for remains the same, not yet known. After reviewing everything that this investigation has produced, the physical examination of the underground space, the search through historical records, the identification of regional patterns, the review of ownership histories, the assessment of material evidence, and the careful consideration of the competing interpretations put forward by researchers. What remains at the end of that process is not a resolved case. It is not a mystery that has been neatly explained or a question that has been cleanly answered. What remains is something more honest than either of those outcomes, and in its own way more useful. It is a structured set of unanswered questions, specific, grounded, and clearly defined, that point toward what still needs to be understood rather than pretending that understanding has already been reached. That outcome deserves to be taken seriously rather than treated as a failure. Investigations into historical spaces and their meanings do not always end with confirmed conclusions. They sometimes end with a clearer picture of what is not known, a map of the gaps rather than a filled-in landscape. And a well-defined gap is genuinely more valuable than a poorly supported answer, because it tells future researchers exactly where to look and what kind of evidence would be needed to make progress. This investigation has produced that kind of clarity, even if it has not produced the resolution that a final answer would provide. Two things have been confirmed through the course of this work. The first is that the underground space exists. That is not a trivial point. Before the renovation survey identified it, the space was unknown to the people responsible for the property and absent from every document associated with it. Its existence is now established, documented, and part of the formal record. Whatever it is real, it has been examined, and its features have been recorded with reasonable care. The second confirmed point is that its features do not match the explanation it was initially given. The utility space categorization was the first official response to the discovery, and the investigation has tested that categorization against the physical evidence in detail. The testing has produced a consistent result. The space does not behave, look, or read like a utility space. Its entrance, its dimensions, its ceiling, its walls, and its complete absence from the historical record all conflict with the utility reading in ways that cannot be resolved through ordinary adjustments or charitable interpretations of the evidence. Those two confirmed points, the existence of the space and the inadequacy of the official explanation, are the solid ground the investigation stands on. Everything else remains open, and the scope of what remains open is considerable. The question of who built the space has not been answered. The material age assessments suggest the stonework may be older than the mansion, but those assessments have not produced a confirmed date range that would allow a builder or a building period to be identified with confidence. The debate among specialists continues. Some believe the stonework places the construction well before the mansion's period. Others believe the apparent age could be accounted for by the use of older salvage materials in a construction that was not itself ancient. Until that debate is resolved through more precise analysis, the identity of the builder or builders and the period in which they worked remains genuinely unknown. The question of what the space was used for is equally open. 3 interpretations have been put forward, each with genuine supporting evidence and each with significant gaps. The private gathering space interpretation fits several of the physical features, but does not account cleanly for the regional pattern. The ancient remnant interpretation addresses the material age question, but struggles with the consistency of features across multiple independently owned estates. The architectural oddity interpretation maintains appropriate caution, but does not engage adequately with the scale and specificity of the evidence. None of these readings has been eliminated. None has been confirmed. The question of function remains the central unresolved issue of the entire investigation, and it is likely to remain unresolved until either documentary evidence surfaces that speaks directly to the space's purpose, or the material analysis produces findings specific enough to support one interpretation over the others. The question of duration, how long the space was used, and across which periods of the property's history, has not been addressed by the available evidence in any meaningful way. A space can be built in one period and used in another. It can be built, used, abandoned, rediscovered, and used again across a span of centuries. Without documentary evidence or datable material traces of specific activity within the space, there is no reliable way to say when use began, when it ended, or whether there were periods of disuse between active phases. This is a significant gap, because the answer would affect how the space relates to the mansion's ownership history and whether the regional pattern of similar spaces represents activity from a single period or from multiple overlapping ones. But this is where it becomes unclear in a way that affects everything else. The removal of the wall fixtures, one of the most distinctive features of the space's current condition, cannot be dated with confidence. If the fixtures were removed recently, in the period of the property's partial disuse before the renovation survey, that would suggest the space had been accessed by someone within living memory or recent history. If the removal was historical, carried out during the mansion's active occupation, that would place it within the documented ownership period and make it a deliberate act by someone connected to the property's history. These two scenarios have very different implications for how the space's story is understood, and the physical evidence, as it currently stands, does not clearly distinguish between them. The regional pattern remains one of the most significant and least resolved aspects of the investigation. The similar spaces identified at neighboring estates have not been subjected to the same level of detailed examination as the mansion's underground room. They were documented separately, categorized within their own local heritage processes, and have not yet been formally analyzed alongside the mansion's case in a comparative study designed to test whether the similarities are meaningful or coincidental. That comparative work is needed, and it has not yet been done. Until it is, the regional pattern remains a significant observation that points toward important questions without providing the structured evidence needed to answer them. Some researchers are still working through the stonework analysis, applying additional techniques to try to narrow the age range of the materials and produce findings specific enough to support or eliminate the ancient remnant interpretation. This work is slow and technically demanding, and its results are not yet available. Others are continuing to search through archives that have not been fully reviewed, collections of documents held in regional repositories that cover the relevant period and area, but have not yet been systematically examined for references to the properties and families involved. Archive research of this kind requires patience and time, and the possibility that relevant documents are still present in unsearched collections cannot be dismissed. The absence of evidence so far does not mean the evidence does not exist. It means it has not been found yet. The ownership history questions also remain open. The clustering of quiet property transfers during the mid-19th century, and the difficulty of tracing the subsequent histories of the families involved, raised questions that have not been answered. Researchers who followed those families through available records found trails that thinned and in some cases disappeared. Whether those trails continue in records that have not yet been examined, or whether they are genuinely sparse because the families in question left few subsequent traces, is unknown. The human dimension of this investigation, who the people were who owned, used, and ultimately departed from these properties, has not been resolved, and that human dimension may hold information relevant to every other question the investigation has raised. At first, it seems like this accumulation of open questions might suggest the investigation has made limited progress, but that reading misunderstands what investigative progress looks like in historical research. Progress in this field is not always measured by the arrival of answers. It is often measured by the refinement of questions, by the process of eliminating weak explanations, identifying the specific points where the evidence is most concentrated, and defining the contours of what is not yet known with enough precision to guide future work effectively. By those measures, the investigation has made genuine progress. The utility explanation has been tested and found inadequate. The features of the space have been documented with a level of detail that earlier assessments did not achieve. The regional pattern has been identified and noted as a significant finding. The ownership history has been reviewed, and its unusual clustering has been flagged for further investigation. These are real advances, even though they have not produced a final answer. What the evidence does suggest, stated carefully and without overstatement, is that the story associated with this mansion and the space beneath it is incomplete. The official account, a straightforward estate building with a standard utility space in its foundations, does not hold up against the physical reality of what has been found. Something is present in that underground room that the official record does not explain and has not acknowledged. Whatever that something is, a remnant of an earlier period, a space designed for purposes that were kept deliberately private, an architectural feature whose function belongs to a tradition that the surviving historical record has not preserved. It represents a gap between the documented history of the property and the actual physical history of the land it stands on. That gap is not unusual in the broadest sense. Historical records are always incomplete. Physical reality always contains more than documentation captures. But the specific shape of this gap, the features it contains, the patterns it repeats, the silence it has maintained across multiple archives and multiple ownership periods, is unusual enough to place this case outside the range of ordinary incompleteness. Something here has been consistently unrecorded in a way that suggests the absence was not accidental, until it is examined more closely, because after that single reference, the structure disappears entirely from the record. There are no follow-up mentions, no demolition notice, no record of it being sold, transferred, abandoned, or replaced. No later survey acknowledges its existence or explains what happened to it. It enters the historical record once, and then it is gone, not gradually, not with any documented transition, but completely and without explanation. This is where the background history of the land begins to connect with the questions already raised about the underground space. The structure in the survey notation and the underground space found beneath the mansion are not confirmed to be the same thing. That connection has not been established, and it would be inaccurate to present it as though it had. But the overlap is difficult to ignore entirely. A structure documented on that specific plot of land, purpose unknown, that then vanishes from every subsequent record, and an underground space found on that same plot, absent from the mansion's own documented history, built with materials that appear older than the mansion itself. The two facts sit alongside each other, and the question of whether they are related has not been answered. When the mansion was eventually constructed on that land, the builders made no reference to any prior structure. This could be explained in several ways. The earlier building may have been fully demolished before construction began, with no trace left visible at ground level. Complete demolition of older structures was common practice when land was cleared for new development, and a building that had been thoroughly removed would leave no obvious reason for its new owners to acknowledge it. The survey notation may also have been an error, a misidentified location, a scribe's mistake, a reference that pointed to an adjacent plot rather than this specific one. Survey records from that era were not always precise, and errors of location were not uncommon. But this is where it becomes unclear, because if the earlier structure was fully demolished and the land was clean when the mansion was built, that explanation still does not account for the underground space. A demolished building does not leave a fully constructed underground structure behind. Demolition removes what is visible. It does not typically destroy what is buried, particularly if the buried elements were not recognized or investigated before construction proceeded above them. If the earlier structure had a significant underground component, and that component was left in place when the surface was cleared, then the mansion could have been built above it without the builders having a complete understanding of what lay beneath. That possibility connects directly to the most significant physical detail in this part of the investigation. The stonework found in sections of the underground space does not match the construction date of the mansion. This is not a minor discrepancy. When materials are assessed for approximate age in historical investigations, the findings carry weight precisely because material dating is based on observable physical characteristics, the type of stone, the method of cutting and shaping, the composition of mortar or binding agents, the weathering and wear patterns that accumulate over time. These characteristics don't change to match a preferred narrative. They reflect what was actually produced and when. The early assessments of the stonework in the underground space indicated that certain sections appear significantly older than the mansion's construction period. The word significantly is important here. A small discrepancy in apparent age could be explained by the use of reclaimed materials, by variations in local stone sources, or by differences in construction technique between different craftsmen. These are legitimate explanations for minor age gaps. But when the apparent age difference is described as significant, those ordinary explanations become less comfortable. They require a larger stretch to accommodate a larger gap. How much older the stonework might be is still being debated. No firm conclusion has been published. Different assessments have produced different ranges, and the uncertainty around those ranges reflects genuine difficulty in pinning down the precise age of materials in an underground environment where moisture, pressure, and other conditions can affect the visible aging process. This ongoing debate is not a sign that the question is being avoided. It is a sign that the question is genuinely difficult to answer with the precision that a confident conclusion would require. But even without a firm date, the existence of the debate itself is informative. The fact that specialists examining the stonework cannot comfortably place it within the mansion's construction era means the material is not behaving the way it should behave if the utility space explanation is correct. A storage room built as part of the original mansion, or added during one of its known renovation periods, should contain materials consistent with those periods. The presence of stonework that reads as significantly older introduces a timeline problem that the standard explanation does not resolve. Some researchers have suggested that this could be explained by the use of salvaged stone. Builders in earlier centuries sometimes incorporated older materials into new constructions, either for practical reasons. Recycling available stone was more efficient than quarrying new material, or for aesthetic ones. If the builders of the underground space, or of some later modification to it, used stone sourced from an older demolished structure nearby, that could account for the apparent age difference, without requiring the underground space itself to be older than the mansion. This is a reasonable argument. It cannot be dismissed. But it also does not fully resolve the problem. The age discrepancy appears not in isolated stones or occasional repurposed blocks, but in sections of the construction. For salvaged material to explain the findings, it would need to account for a significant portion of the stonework in those sections, all sourced from older material, all incorporated in a way that appears structurally consistent rather than patched or supplementary. That is possible, but it raises its own question. Where did that older stone come from, and why is there no record of its sourcing or use? The land history brings this question back around to the survey notation. If a structure once stood on that plot and was later cleared, its stone could theoretically have been incorporated into new construction. That would create exactly the kind of age discrepancy found in the underground space. Older material appearing within a newer structure. But it would also mean that the earlier structure was not simply demolished and removed. Its physical material persisted on the site. Some of it, perhaps, persists still. This is the persistent problem that the background history of the land introduces. The underground space may not belong to the mansion's history at all. Its materials, its absence from the documentary record, and the earlier reference to a structure on the same land all point toward the possibility that what lies beneath the mansion is not a product of the mansion's construction or ownership. It may be a remnant of something older, something that existed before the mansion was built, before the land was formally surveyed as an estate property, and possibly before the period that the current investigation was originally focused on. That possibility does not come with a confirmed identity. The earlier structure referenced in the survey notation has no documented purpose, no known builder, and no recorded fate. The underground space has no confirmed age, no agreed function, and no documentary origin. Whether they are related remains an open question. But the combination of a vanished prior structure and an underground space with materials that don't fit the mansion's timeline creates a problem that the official utility explanation was never designed to address. The investigation was initially focused on a specific building and a specific period of its history, but the evidence, as it has accumulated, keeps pointing in a direction that stretches further back in time than that initial frame allows. And the further back the questions reach, the less the existing documentation is able to provide answers. As the documentation process continued and researchers spent more time examining the physical details of the underground space, something began to shift in how the investigation was developing. The early questions had been focused on the historical record, on what was missing from the documents, on the land's prior history, on the age of the materials. Those were important findings, but they were findings rooted in paper and archive work. What began to emerge next came from the space itself, from the physical features that surveyors were observing, measuring, and recording as they worked through the documentation systematically. What they found was a collection of inconsistencies, not a single dramatic contradiction, but a set of details that, when looked at carefully and honestly, did not fully align with the category the space had been placed into. Each inconsistency, taken on its own, might be explained. Each one, viewed in isolation, might be absorbed into the utility space, reading, without too much difficulty. But they did not appear in isolation. They appeared together, as a cluster, and that cluster created a problem that became increasingly difficult to set aside the more precisely the documentation work proceeded. The first inconsistency, and the one that surveyors noted earliest in the process, involved the entrance to the space. This is worth examining carefully, because entrance design in utility spaces is not a decorative consideration. It is a functional one. The entire purpose of a utility space in an estate setting is to support the working operation of the household. Storage rooms need to be accessed regularly. Supplies need to be moved in and out. Workers need to be able to reach the space efficiently, sometimes carrying heavy or bulky items, sometimes moving quickly between tasks. All of this demands a practical entrance, one that is easy to reach, appropriately sized for the traffic it needs to accommodate, and logically connected to the parts of the estate where that traffic originates. In a well-designed estate, utility spaces were typically connected to the service infrastructure of the property. Entrances opened from kitchens, from staff corridors, from ground-level external access points, or from the working areas where the household's functional activity was concentrated. The placement of a utility entrance was not arbitrary. It followed the logic of the work the space was meant to support. An experienced architect or estate designer would position such an entrance exactly where it needed to be to serve its purpose efficiently. The entrance found here did not follow that logic. It was narrow, narrower than a functional access point for a working storage area would typically be. It was partially concealed, positioned in a way that did not present itself as an obvious or intended entry point. And its location within the building was the detail that raised the clearest question. It was situated in a section of the mansion that had no connection to any known service area, not near the kitchens, not adjacent to a staff corridor, not accessible from any external ground-level point associated with the working parts of the estate. Reaching it required passing through two separate rooms. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Those two rooms, based on the original architectural layout of the mansion, were not part of the working areas of the estate. They were interior rooms, rooms associated with the private or formal sections of the building rather than its service infrastructure. A worker carrying supplies to a storage area does not pass through the private rooms of an estate. That is precisely what service passages and dedicated utility corridors were designed to prevent. The entire point of separate service infrastructure in estates of this kind was to keep the working movement of the household away from the formal and private spaces. An entrance that requires passing through private interior rooms to reach a utility space is not functioning as a utility entrance. It is functioning as something else. What that something else might be is not immediately clear, but the placement is inconsistent with the purpose the space was officially assigned, and that inconsistency cannot be resolved simply by pointing to the physical existence of the entrance. The question is not whether the entrance exists. The question is why it is positioned where it is, in a way that makes no practical sense for a working storage area. The second inconsistency involved the interior dimensions of the space. When surveyors moved past the entrance and began documenting the space from the inside, one of the things they recorded was that the interior was larger than the entrance suggested it would be. This is not an impossible feature. Buildings of all kinds sometimes contain spaces that open up beyond what their entry points imply. And in an underground structure, where the relationship between entrance and interior can be less immediately readable than in an above-ground room, a size discrepancy might seem unremarkable at first glance. But this is where it becomes unclear. For a simple storage area, interior dimensions are typically kept practical and proportional. The space is sized to accommodate what it needs to hold, with enough room for workers to move and access what is stored. Builders working on underground utility spaces did not add unnecessary volume without reason. Digging and constructing underground space required significant labor and material investment. Every additional unit of space had a cost attached to it. Storage rooms were built to the size they needed to be. They were not built larger than their function required. A space that is noticeably larger than its entrance suggests, and larger than functional storage logic would justify, is a space that was built with dimensions that served a different purpose than storage. What that purpose might be remains an open question, But the size itself is a design decision. Someone determined how large the space should be, and the result does not match the measurements of a practical storage area. That gap between the size of the space and the logic of its supposed function adds a second layer of difficulty to the utility category explanation. The third inconsistency is the one that surveyors found hardest to dismiss. It concerns the interior of the space at the level of its built-in features, or more precisely, at the level of what was absent from it. A functional storage space in an estate of this era would not have been a bare room. It would have contained the physical infrastructure needed to support its function: shelving for stored goods, hooks or mounting points for hanging items, drainage features to manage moisture in an underground environment where water management was a genuine concern, ventilation provisions to allow air circulation and prevent the kind of damp accumulation that would damage stored goods over time. These are not optional extras. They are the components that make a storage space function as a storage space. An underground room without shelving, without drainage, without ventilation, is not a storage room in any practical sense. It is a room that was built below ground, finished to a certain standard, and then left without the features that would allow it to serve a storage purpose. The shell of a utility space, without its utility.